When Emma was 8 years old, she was always a little prayer warrior, and she was also a little chatty Cathy, and she always would try to tell people about the Lord, and she's never quit since. And when she got married in age, she found a man that was just as special as she is. And I'm just so proud to have them here today. Most of all, I thank the Lord that He spared Emma for us because she is such a precious young lady. And I pray that today she'll just be able to tell y'all everything that happened. And it's just such a heart-wrenching story. But I just love her so much, and I'm just so thankful. But she's got 3 children. She's got an 8-year-old little girl and twin girls, and she lives in Carthage. And Emma, I'm going to turn it over to you and Joe now.
Hey guys, can you hear me okay? So she kind of did my introduction for me. I have a 9-year-old and I have 2 twin girls that are 2. And I live about an hour from here, and my lovely grandparents, Gina and Edith, go to church here. But I'm just here to tell you guys a little bit about what God brought me through this year and how faithful He is. So it was January 9th of last year when everything happened. I started getting cold-like symptoms, normal cough, sneezes. I didn't really think anything of it. I went to the urgent care, got diagnosed with the flu, and I went home, tried to just feel better from that, and then fast forward, I ended up going to the ER twice before the second time when they really realized how serious things were. I remember my chest was just on fire. It felt like I couldn't catch my breath. It was burning. I just really couldn't breathe. And I remember fighting through that for what seemed like hours. It was hours. It was probably all day long that I just fought through that pain of not being able to breathe. And I remember finally I overheard them talking about putting me on a ventilator and life support. And at that time, I knew nothing about the medical field. So I thought, okay, so this is it for me. As much as I was hurting and I was in pain, I felt like I was dying. And when they talked about putting me on life support, I was like, okay, this is it. And I told my husband that night, it was late evening, I told him just goodbye and that I loved him and my girls. And I just remember the prayer that I had with God very vividly that night. And just telling him that I was so thankful for my life and that I'm just thankful for everything He's done for me. And if it was my time to go, that I was ready. And shortly after that, they life-flighted me to Duke. And I don't remember anything after that. They had paralyzed me. So that's exactly why I have my husband here, because not only is it my story, but he had to sit there every day for 2 months and watch me go through this and keep up my family and my girls. And this was a big part of his story too. So he's going to tell a little bit about everything that happened while I was actually paralyzed and explain that in further detail that I can.
Can you hear me okay? So when the doctor, we were fighting back at the ER before they had paralyzed her. I was watching her go through this where she was going 50 to 60 breaths per minute for about 8 to 9 hours straight. And the ICU doctor came down and kind of pulled me to the side and said that young people her age have a habit of fighting so hard that they basically kill themselves. Older people will kind of give into, more machines and stuff like that. But somebody as young and as healthy as she was, their body just doesn't understand it, and their immune system takes over and kind of just breaks things down. That's why they wanted to get a handle on things before it had gotten worse. So, this entire time that she's basically suffocating is what it looked like and sounded like. They brought us up to the ICU there at Moore Regional and had basically said that, we're going to put her on life support, which never in my wildest dream would I have ever imagined this happening to us. So they pulled me up to her. They said, you need to say goodbye now. And so that's when, she had told me that. And that was the sentence that had rang in my head every single day for over a month until I got to speak to her again. And it was haunting. I remember telling God every night, I said, that is not going to be the last time that I got to speak to her. And at that time, I didn't realize it until after they had life flighted her to Duke, because they had better equipment and life support systems there to make it that's when they sat me down. We got to Duke just to tell me how sick she really was. When she had told you how fast this went, it's not something that like progresses and then it slowly deteriorates. It was overnight. I mean, the day before she had, like she said, she had cold-like symptoms, something that she sweated out 100 times before, but this one was just different. One of the first things that I had noticed was her extremities were really dark whenever she was first put under, and the doctor had explained to me that her blood pressure was so dangerously low that they had to put her on 3 different types of blood pressure medications in order to keep her vitals, the blood flowing on her vitals, which constricts the blood flow to her extremities. So she was losing blood flow. The longer she was on those medications was the longer that her extremities went without blood flow. So when we got to Duke, after they had sat down and told me that she was diagnosed with the flu, which we already knew, and something called ARDS. It's a acute respiratory distress syndrome, and it's basically the state that her lungs were in were a really inflammatory state. They were swollen, full of fluid, and basically they were out of service. That's why they had to put her on a ventilator, because they could no longer do anything for her. When we first got to Duke, the first week they had told us every day we had like a little powwow of what they were going to do differently. And that's when they had mentioned that they were going to prone her. That's where they flip her over on her stomach. It's about an hour process to get her flipped over with all the equipment and tubes hanging out of her, to allow her back to be exposed so her lungs can expand with the machine that gives her body a little bit more oxygen. And that's when, it started to, show some better signs but she was still, in an unconscious state. They told us that she had a severe toxic shock. That was the bacteria that was in her bloodstream. And I know you've probably heard sepsis before. This was considered the ultimate sepsis. Toxic is, in many cases, fatal. And that's the doctors told me that, you need to have an open mind about everything that we do, and that they're going to try their best. Every time I would tell them, how important she was to us, it was straight professional back to me that we're going to do all we can. And that was the response that I got for a long time. She suffered several lung collapses while she was in there. Every day she would get an X-ray, and because her lungs were going through so much and the ventilator's kind of rough on your lungs, that it would cause like pneumothoraxes, like micro punctures in her lungs where air would escape into her chest cavity. So they were having to put several tubes inside of her chest to not only drain the air, but drain fluid as well that was escaping from her lungs. I think in one day they drained 3 liters of fluid out of her chest. And that was very terrifying. At this point, she's still proned, and the doctors, I remember waking up that morning, and they were telling me, she really liked the proning, is what they would say. Her body was showing some signs of improvement. And she was suffering a really bad fever as well, so they kind of had to play things easy. During that process, she had suffered it was kind of like a heart murmur is how they explained it to me. All of these doctors came in. It was the chief lung doctor of the room had walked in, and they were doing their meeting. So it was the perfect time for this event to happen, but it was very strange timing as well. As soon as he walked in with all of his, their lab coats and stuff, they cut the lights on, and her heart rate went from, like a 80 to 90 beats per second to instantly 170 beats per second. And it stayed in that state. I remember it was just really hectic. They rushed me out of the room. I didn't know what was going on. They were ripping her clothes off, putting defibrillators on her and all this. And then they explained to me after that they had to give her a medication to stop her heart completely. He said just enough to scare you, to restart her heart on a normal rhythm. And that's never guaranteed. So that was, I remember having a really bad breakdown that day, because it was very traumatic. After 2 weeks of being on the ventilator, the doctors thought that her numbers were at a decent enough progression that they were going to start to slowly wean her off of the sedation and try to wake her up. It was I remember that day, everyone was kind of smiling. I was starting to put things behind me a little bit, and they sat her up, and it's, the wake up process is not like you see in the movies. It's a very, very traumatic. They don't just wake up and say, "Where have I been?" They're on very intense narcotics that are, medications. She's waking up with all these tubes, going down her throat and all this. It was very bad. And I remember not only did her heart rate spike, but her breathing rate spiked. And her lungs are very fragile at this point. I think one of the doctors told me you can compare them to a wet brown paper bag, so you have to be very gentle. You can tell her all you want to just relax, but she has no idea what's going on. It's very panicky, so they had to sedate her again and paralyze her again, and it was like it all got ripped away from us. I remember after that the next x-ray was like twice as bad as it had been before. And that's when the doctor pulled me to the side and said, "I know that we said that we thought that she was beyond the lung machine, and I hate that I told you that, but I do think that it is the best route for her to go." The lung machine is something called ECMO. What this machine does is they have to plug into her main artery that's coming out. They pump all of her blood from her body through this machine, which then puts oxygen into her blood and then comes into another artery on the other side. So she's basically doing nothing to live. It was so weird coming in there and seeing her chest not move. She's not breathing anymore, but her body's still living. And I remember, me and her mother, I kind of always had her mom there with me. We were going through it at the same time, and she was a really strong rock for me to have in there. But she was going through the same thing, and it was really hard because I always had that ECMO, is what we called it, in my back pocket. I always said, I always have that to fall on, and here I am on it. And if this fails, I'm going to be raising these girls alone. And it was really hard. The next 3 weeks that she was on that ECMO, it was very quiet. They're basically, letting her lungs rest after the first traumatic wake-up process. And after, a few weeks of not doing anything, they did see some slight improvement on the inflammatory side, to where every week a different doctor would shift onto the ICU floor, and he would run it for the entire week. So I would get to know one really well, and the next thing you know, I'm meeting another one that is having to read her case and then start over. And every doctor had their own opinions on different things and how they wanted to go things. Well, I get one doctor, his name is Dr. Rackley, and as soon as he comes in, my nurse tells me he's called the wake-up doctor. He likes to, get people up and, try to get them going, and that's exactly what he did. This is the second wake-up process that Emma will be able to tell you a little more about.
So my first memories from waking up was trying to figure out where my kids were, first of all, and then not being able to communicate. So When I had the trach in, I couldn't talk. So I really wasn't even good at mouthing things at the time. I would try to communicate in every way that I could just to try and get my point across as to where I was or why I was hooked up to all these machines. I had no idea what was going on. My arms were tied down to the bed even, so it's like I couldn't even use my arms to make gestures. And the reason my arms were tied down is so that I didn't rip out all of my tubes. My eyes were paralyzed when I woke up, so I could look around and I would see, if you guys are sitting on this side, I would see two of all of y'all. So I couldn't really explain to anybody what was going on with me and just try and get answers as to why this was happening to me. I had blisters all over my body from the sepsis infection. I had tubes coming out of my neck. I had chest tubes coming out of my two here, two on my sides. I had ECMO stitched down my legs, which were about the size of quarter tubes going down my legs, pumping all the blood out of my body. You rarely hear of people even on ECMO that are up and awake. So that was really traumatic. I just remember feeling so claustrophobic with all of these tubes coming out of my body. The very next thing I remember was them standing me up for physical therapy for the first time. And this was the first time that I had been up out of the bed, so I looked straight down, and the first thing I saw was my feet. And I remember my toes were black, and I was like, what is going on? Why are my toes black? I still couldn't talk at the time. But I was thinking, okay, you know what? It's just because I'm sick. They're going to go back to normal. Just focus on right now. So later that day, a podiatrist came in, and that's when she told me that my toes were going to have to be amputated. And she basically was like, okay, let's schedule it for this Friday. And that's the first time that I really broke down and realized how much everything that's happened to me is going to change my life. But I remember thinking, you know what, God, if I come out of here alive and I walk out of here alive and I have to have some toes amputated, you know, praise the Lord, because God does everything for a reason. And I knew that. But later that day, my pastor visited, and I was telling him about everything that the podiatrist had said, and I remember him saying, you know what, Emma, if you're out somewhere someday and somebody looks down at your foot and they ask you what's wrong, that's a way for you to tell somebody about the Lord right there. So that began to give me a new perspective on things. But I did end up getting a second opinion from a highly recommended vascular surgeon who later told me I could potentially lose my leg from the knee down because of a heel ulcer that wasn't healing on my leg. So we decided to wait it out and see what my body would heal on its own and then go from there, which we'll tell you about here shortly. But after that, they did a trial run with the ECMO where they would cut it off. They would see how long I would last without all of that extra support. And then eventually they were able to remove it, leaving me with just my ventilator and my trach. So one night after all of that, or after they removed my ECMO and everything, a nurse came in and he was changing my IV. In the ICU, you had to have 2 IVs at all times. So I would have one in my neck, and then they had one in my arm, and it fell out the night before. So he came in and he was changing that for me. And the very first thing, I was sitting with my back turned, and there's this guy walking in. It's the nurse that's going to change my IV. He walks in, and I'm facing the window because it's like once a day I would get out of my bed and sit in a chair. So that's what I was doing. And the first thing I hear him say is, "Are you a believer?" And at this time, I still couldn't talk or communicate hardly in any way. I just kind of shook my head like yes. And he said, "I felt Jesus when I walked in this room." And he proceeded to ask me if he could pray with me. And he knelt down, and I remember him saying the most beautiful prayer, but that's just something I'll never forget. And I remember tears just filling my eyes because I was so worn down at that time, and God sends people just when we need them. And people may think I'm crazy, but I asked every nurse and doctor who this man was, and no one could tell me. But my mom and my stepdad was in the room with me when this guy came in. But I know that God sent him there to comfort me. But at this point, my main focus was PT, which is physical therapy, learning how to walk again, talk again, eat, do all the things that I had lost. I had lost close to 30 pounds at this time. I couldn't lift my arms. I couldn't roll on my side. I couldn't do anything on my own. I had to use the bathroom and the bed for weeks because I couldn't move. Them sitting me up in the bed felt like the worst pain that I've ever been through. But little by little, I would make small accomplishments like brushing my own teeth, or I remember the very first time I washed my hands for the first time on my own. Then eventually taking a couple of steps and then even standing on my own. I knew I had to fight to get home to my kids. I had a doctor that came in shortly after I was doing all this physical therapy, and she said, "I'm telling you, you are the biggest miracle I've ever seen since I've been working here." And there was a physical therapist that I had, and she would always say, "You need to just accept this new version of yourself because you're not you anymore." And I remember that making me so mad. And I'm just like, why would you say that to me? But you know what? She's right. Because God has given me just a new outlook on life, and I'm filled with Him more than I ever have been before.
So, at a total of 54 days in the ICU at Duke, she stayed before they released her to go to what is called a less intensive care unit, where they would step her down to, free up that space. And then she was in there for another 10 days before they ultimately released her. It was really hard that last 10 days that we were there, because we're kind of, they weren't necessarily shooing her out the door, but she was still suffering from partial lung collapses, those pneumothoraxes that I had told you about. And I think she had had one 2 days prior to even being released. So it was a big fear, us being sent home. How will we know? They're only knowing because they x-ray her. But we just had to have faith that their opinion was right when they sent us home. They sent us home with oxygen tanks. She's not walking because her foot, the weight, she was having to non-load bearing, so she couldn't walk. It was going to be very traumatic, getting home, and then not only getting home, but being able to, keep her away from two mangy 12-month-olds that were running around at the time. And it was just, it was a lot to go into, but we were definitely excited to get her home. I'll never forget, I remember where I was at on the road when my pastor had called me, and when I told him, I said, "We got her, and she's on the way home." And it was just, it was very, there was a lot of tears on that drive. It was very traumatic, but very happy. The vascular surgeon that she had told you about, that we had decided to go with his opinion on, to allow her foot to basically, they could go in and start cutting things off, but it's such every time you cut something, there's a risk of infection, and then you got to lose more. So what they were kind of hoping is that her body would show what can be healed and what cannot be healed, and will start to, push away things that would never live. Your body's the ultimate chooser of that. And I'm very, very thankful that we went with his opinion, because had she went with the podiatrist's opinion on that day, they would have taken half her foot on the first day. And we ended up escaping with the best case scenario, which was one toe and then the tips of the others on the left foot. Her right foot is completely unscathed. And we're very, very blessed. We're in the process right now of, she's already been fitted for a silicone prosthetic that would match her right side. So she'll be able to wear her open-toed shoes and stuff. Like she has run me out of every closet we've ever been to with all her shoes. So
Shoes have always been my thing.
I remember telling the doctors, I said, I'd give her mine if I could, because if it happened to me, that stuff wouldn't bother me. But I knew that kind of stuff really would affect her. But like she said, it was God had her on this for a reason, and I tell everyone this. And Emma's to know Emma is to love Emma, and what you see is what you get. Doesn't matter what crowd you're around, you're going to get the same Emma. She's not going to try and please you, and she's going to tell you what's on her mind. And I wouldn't wish what she had went through on my worst enemy, but I couldn't think of a better person to be able to carry that story with for the rest of her life, which is her.
So I remember when I got pregnant with the twins, I remember asking God, like, why me? Not that I wasn't excited and I wasn't grateful, but I was just thinking, there's no way I can take care of 2 babies at one time. But it turned out to be the best thing that's ever happened to me. But right before I left the hospital, the very last thing the doctor said to me is he said, it would be the worst thing medically for you to get pregnant. And I just thought back to those words that when I had talked to God and said, why me? And he knew exactly why. And I'm just so thankful that I have those little girls, and God looks out for us far more than we can see. Just such a special God. Right before I got sick, I'd just gotten a treadmill. I was running every day. I was in the healthiest shape of my life, 25 years old. I had plans to take my stepdaughter to the mountains on a birthday trip the following week. Little did I know that my whole entire world would be turned upside down. I say all this just because there is nothing in the world that we can be sure of other than our salvation. And none of this is about me and what I went through. It's about God getting all the glory for it, and we just never know what our tomorrow will hold or what we may face. So it's just so important to make sure that you're right with the Lord. And that's just my message to people is if I had died that day, I want people to realize how fast things can happen. But that's all. That's our story. So God is just so good, and he's been so faithful to us, and we're just so grateful. And we have some great praying grandparents that go here.
Thank you all who prayed. I could see it happening before my eyes. Everywhere else you hear these miracles and see stuff on the TV or read a book, but I'm telling you, I saw it with my own eyes, and we wouldn't be here today were it not for all the prayers. And I know things were working up there in heaven. So thank y'all.
And one last thing is I was talking to Joe on the way here, and I was just like, there is no possible way that I could have felt the peace that I felt while being in the hospital. If someone was to tell me right now that was going to happen to me and it had never happened before, I think my human side would be so bitter. Like, why would I have to go through that? But while I was there and I was going through it, all I wanted to do was praise the Lord. And when God says, I'll give you a peace that passes all understanding, he means it, because you truly understand that peace when you're enduring such a terrible suffering. And that was truly the most peaceful. And to be going through all that I was going through while feeling that was just amazing.
There's not a thing this world can offer that gave her the peace that I saw. And that's all we can say about it.
Yeah. All right, and then we have